This is the podcast Person of Interest, where we meet extraordinary people with a story to tell. In this episode, Mike Collier has invited the editor-in-chief of Axios, Nicholas Johnston, to talk about the business model of a 21st century media company.
Welcome back to the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga for another in our series of podcasts in which we speak to people who know what they're talking about. My guest today is Nicholas Johnston, and he's from a company called Axios, a media company. There's a high-profile, high-class media conference happening in the building now, and we're very grateful to Nicholas for making some time to come and visit us. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Your job title is reassuringly normal, editor-in-chief. There are some pretty extreme ones floating around in the conference here. And Axios, for those who aren't aware of what it is, could you just give us a little resume of what Axios is?
We are a new media company. We were founded in Washington, D.C. in 2016, launched in 2017. The idea being how to get people smarter, faster on the topics that matter. Really figuring out how to deliver information, not just digital first, but mobile first. Spending a lot of time before we launched understanding how people consume information, how they're drowning in information on their smartphones, and how can we build a media company sort of that writes in a style that we call Smart Brevity. The two pieces of that being like smart, hiring really good subject matter experts, journalists who know their stuff and can cut through all of the noise to explain what's happening. And then Brevity, writing in a style that is very much built for a mobile phone. It's sort of every one of our articles are generally condensed to about 150 words as a key element that which is the amount of screen space you have on an iPhone, along with our visuals, and providing it in a way where you can sort of skim it and scan it. If you look at an Axios article, and I have to say signup.axios.com for our newsletters, you'll see that it just looks differently than a lot of traditional media organizations, in that we're not writing in sort of such a straight narrative fashion, because we've spent a lot of time looking at how people consume information on their mobile phones, how they use their thumbs, how they skim through information. And so we're trying to figure out, how do we use bolded text, how do we use bullets, how do we use lists, how do we use different kinds of formatting to help a reader consume information in a way that we know they're consuming information. Like the data and the analytics on information consumption are just incredibly clear in sort of how attention spans are shrinking and how much time we're spending staring at our mobile phones. And so that's where we have to go meet the reader. And so we built a media company to do that.
I mean, it seems almost that there's a bit of a paradox there. We're spending more time staring at our mobile phones, and yet our attention spans are shrinking. So
because I can move my thumb 2 centimeters and do whatever I want, right? Like, I think what many journalists don't realize yet is that the internet has been invented. The internet has been invented, and then the smartphone has been invented. So now I have the internet on my smartphone. And within that little cube, everything humankind has ever created is there. Every movie, every book, every song, every piece of information. I can go on dates. I can order food. I can book travel. It's all in that. And all of those things are competing for the 5 seconds that I'm going to spend on my phone. So it's not just the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Axios competing for those seconds. It's Google, it's Amazon, it's Facebook, it's Tinder, it's Starbucks, all of those competing for those eyeballs. And so you have to have a really compelling value proposition to cut through all of that. And our value proposition is like, okay, you have 14 seconds to kill. We can deliver information in a way that after those 14 seconds, you'll be smarter, faster on a lot of these different topics.
This is very interesting. I mean, it suggests that maybe the implication is that, let's call them traditional news media, traditional journalists, are kind of trapped in an ivory tower and haven't faced the sort of brutal reality that you've outlined.
They are slowly. There are two things I will say about that. Is I think we're on to something at Axios because a lot of traditional news organizations are stealing it. If you look at how a lot of mainstream media organizations in the United States, the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, sort of are changing the way they present information online, are changing the way they publish their newsletters, they're embracing a lot of the things that we do. Sort of the use of bolding, the use of bullets, spending a lot more time thinking about how I format a story for reader engagement as opposed to just typing sentences. But at the same time, sort of pulling against that narrative. I mentioned that an Axios story, the key element is 150 words because that fits on an iPhone. Well, think about, why is an average newspaper story 850 to 1,000 words long? Like, why is that the length they picked? Probably because in 1850, they bought a printing press, and that's how big the piece of paper was. That is still something that they're beholden to. And even not just at legacy organizations. I was at Bloomberg for 14 years. The Bloomberg story length was 850 words. Why was that? Was that a legacy of the Wall Street Journal's printing press in the 1900s? I mean, there are still these things that pull us in these directions that is so hard to break free from. And that's one of the reasons why I left my job and sort of joined Axios, is because we could start from a whiteboard and we could try and create a sort of a newsroom and a journalism culture that casts away all those kinds of things and sort of embraces where we are as humans right now, which is drowning in information and staring at our smartphones.
So did you feel then that what you were doing at Bloomberg and previously, there was a lot of wasted effort, as it were? I mean, you're producing big stories and you've got the feeling that people aren't reading more than the first couple of paragraphs.
There is a moment in the life of every creator of content where they get access to their analytics. And I call it like it's the analytics apocalypse. Like all your worst fears are suddenly confirmed. You're sort of like, wait, nobody's clicking on any of these stories. Nobody's scrolling on any of these kinds of stories. Wait, why was the reader engagement time on this 1,000-word story only 8 seconds? Well, they're not reading 1,000 words in 8 seconds. And when content creators encounter that apocalypse, they sort of like, they can act two ways. They almost all react one way. They're thinking like, okay, well, how can I boost that number? Mm-hmm. Like what can I create in a way to drive that reader engagement number up? Like how more immersive,
or to make them read more.
Right, to like make them do more. And sometimes there's a business imperative in that, and that they've got to scroll through more ads. I look at that number as a challenge. Like if the reader is saying, I only have 15 seconds, what if I gave them a story that only took them 10 seconds and gave them 5 seconds of their life back? Like no one's going to give them a greater gift today than the ability to go spend 5 more seconds with their children or staring out the window doing nothing. And so I think being very, being reflexive, being very appreciative of like the value of a reader's time is very important. Because remember, let's get back to this, right? I can move my thumb 2 centimeters and do whatever I want.
Is there a limit? I mean, is there a base amount of time that you think is sort of the minimum that you can actually say something meaningful in? Because it would seem to suggest from what you're saying that if the attention span and the time available becomes smaller and smaller, then you've got to shrink and shrink and shrink to...
I mean, is there a lower bound? I mean, when Elon Musk creates those brain intersections, I mean, the lower bound will be 0. We'll just learn this kind of stuff instantaneously. I don't know, like scientifically, where that lower bound is. But if you look at, if you think about how we communicate to people, like one of our great writers, Mike Allen, who writes Axios AM, that's our morning sort of tip sheet on the 10 biggest stories to read, loves to talk about something he calls the barstool test, where if you're at a bar watching a sporting event with a friend and you want to tell them something, you've got about 2 sentences to get it right. How long does that take? I don't know, 7, 8, 10 seconds, but like that's the engaging moment. And if you look at, and so very much in our newsroom, I convince people sort of like, what's your headline, what's your first sentence? Nail that. And then once you've engaged the reader, your third sentence is what we call an axiom, typically a why it matters. So now you're explaining to the reader why they just engaged with that. And readers love being told in the second sentence, oh, this is why I'm reading that. But if you think about those 2 sentences, that's all you've got. And if you think about the way we write a lot of news articles, if I think back sort of to the traditional way I would write a news story and the way it started and all these sorts of habits and tropes that I would put into it, like, this is not engaging for a reader. This is just awful. And so if you ask me for the lower bound, I think you get 2 sentences. So however long it takes you to read 2 sentences is about.
From what you've said, and actually from having a look at the Axios site myself, I was really struck by, even though we're talking about this as a new media company, and you're talking about these thresholds and this new way of thinking about addressing the readers, a lot of it really reminded me of what, for want of a better word, I'll call good old-fashioned way of constructing a story. I mean, I can imagine an old-school editor standing there and doing the barstool test as well and saying, look, if you haven't got him within 2 sentences, forget about it. The art of headline writing and so on. Is it not the case that, in a way, you're returning to these more traditional values, and that what we've had for the last, say, 20 years is just the fact that the internet is infinite and you have to fill it, or feel that you have to fill it with everything?
No, that's a really good point. And when I talk to sort of like strong editors from wire services for like AP and sort of when I was at Bloomberg. Like we were very much focused on sort of like what is at Bloomberg it was called the fill, which was essentially 2 sentences you had that you had to get out sort of after the headline. And AP for flashes and bulletins does the exact same kind of thing. I mean, the tragedy, at least in my old job, is that after we did that, we would just keep typing. And we would type. We didn't have, as I mentioned, we didn't have the courage to take our hands off the keyboard when we were done with those sort of first key 2 sentences.
Or maybe you felt obliged to keep typing.
Like, you didn't have it, like you couldn't answer the question, right? Like I think about this a lot. You know, in the United States, we spend a lot of time covering the president's tweets and struggling with how we cover the president's tweets. And I'm always sad when the president does a thing on Twitter, which is kind of interesting, but not earth-shattering. And I think of newspapers that don't have a mechanism to say, like, you know what, this is only worth about 110 words, so I'm going to stop typing. Because they have to sort of fill all these column inches. Like for us, like, no, we can stop. We can just give you 2 sentences on that. But the flip side of that is, which you alluded to, is sort of like if I'm drowning in information, it becomes far more important to know, like, well, what do I need to know, right? Like I can find anything, but I can't find what's important, right? And so it becomes far more important to have subject matter experts, very experienced journalists, to then write that 3rd sentence, right? Like I can train someone right out of college to nail how to write a good headline, how to pick a compelling visual, how to write a good first sentence. I cannot train them into finishing the why it matters. That I have to give them years and years of experience for. So I think when you meld those 2 kinds of things, you get exactly to kind of that sweet spot that we try and use to solve sort of the downside of information overload.
This why it matters is an interesting part of your content, I think, because on the surface maybe it looks like you're almost pushing a viewpoint, but really it seems to me that this is what you referred to as having people who really know what they're writing about.
Right.
But you have to then have the reader trusts them. I mean, how do you establish that trust? Because if someone's telling you why it matters and you're kind of taking it on trust.
So my reader trust joke is that Axios is very good in the reader trust department because we didn't get the 2016 election wrong. It's because we didn't exist. So we're doing well on that. Part of it is, I think we achieved a little bit, and I get this in feedback from readers, it's just being so clear about it and sort of stating up front sort of like why we're writing this. I mean, and I engage with readers a lot sort of in the feedback on this. Like there's a universe of people who don't care, right? Who don't want to see the other side. And if you write something bad about Trump, they'll hate you. If they write something good about Trump, a different group will hate you. But there is a universe of people that are very hungry for real information that they can trust. And when it's distilled down into 1 sentence, and it's the 2nd sentence of a story, that kind of clarity, I think, builds reader trust because you're not hiding what you're trying to say. You're saying, like, look, I'm an expert on this. Like, I've reported this out. This is what's happening.
And is there, does that include a sort of unity of tone as well? Because when you have people who are real, old sweats in a certain beat, they can sometimes have quite an individual voice.
Yeah.
Do they have to kind of comply to the Axios?
No, we let
tone,
we let voice shine through. And so, like, I think a lot about the universe of media brands and journalist brands. Traditionally, the only way you could exist as a journalist is like I write for the New York Times. And so like there would still be transcendent bylines at the New York Times that would bust through, but it was still sort of the Times. But now that I can carry a smartphone and I can tweet and I can publish all I sort of want, those bylines become very, very important. And you can sort of understand like, oh, I trust this story more. Like consumers become even smarter the way journalists would. Like, if you're a journalist, you read bylines a lot. You're like, oh, is this the smart person? I think readers are becoming smarter about that. And those bylines become very important. And like our star reporters are very much read by the readers for those kinds of bylines. And because we built newsletters a lot, that's a key component of our business. It creates an incredible connection with the reader and allows a lot of that sort of voice to shine through. And when I know that the person on the other end of that newsletter is an actual human being, is an actual person, and I sort of know what their passions and interests are, I think it makes them more trustworthy because I see it as like a real human.
Speaking of media and journalists and these people as individual human beings, do they do sort of in the field reporting as well, or do you really just have a kind of a pool of editors who are taking in sources? I mean, scanning the site, a lot of it was coming from academic reports, was coming from other sources, which may be original in that no one else is reporting on them, but it didn't strike me as being that kind of sidewalk thumping journalism.
We don't do, two answers to that. We don't do anecdote a lot. There's very little utility in standing around on a street corner and getting a man on the street quote about something, because the man on the street doesn't know what they're talking about. That's why they're standing. That's why they're standing on a street corner. And so we try and strip away sort of all that kind of artifice. It just doesn't lend ourselves to our type of writing for the most part. But what our style does do means my reporters are spending less time typing. As in, they're not calling some university professor for a quote that I just need to fill out a story. They're not typing 1,000 words because that's the only format I have. They're giving me the 200 words that I needed of the news that they have, and then they're done. Okay. And they can go do something else.
But then they are reliant upon other reporters to get some of that information.
Right. So we are source agnostic as a newsroom. That means that I have a breaking news desk that just scours the universe for pieces of information, and then puts them in Axios style and delivers them to our reader. If you think about the greatest if you think of the greatest news reporter in the history of the universe, and they run a beat, they wouldn't get all the stories on that beat. That's impossible. If they got 50% of the stories, they'd be one of the greatest reporters ever. But the traditional model of journalism would then ignore the other 50% of the stories. If it appeared in the Washington Post, well, I'm not going to publish it into the New York Times. Like, I've literally been in newsrooms where I've killed stories because they appeared someone else, literally withholding information from my readers because another group of readers got that information. Right. That's preposterous. Why would I do that? What I do now is, like, something I've never said in my newsroom is, can you match that? Right? Let's say Maggie Haberman of the New York Times, a spectacular Trump reporter, beats my spectacular Trump reporter, Jonathan Swan, on a scoop. It happens, they're in constant competition. I take that Maggie Haberman scoop, the New York Times publishes it, they give it away, I can highlight it for my readers, and I can have Swan go figure out what the next thing is to try and beat Maggie the next time. And so it's very much trying to free up the reporters to sort of pursue original lines of reporting instead of sort of matching what other people write, or in this, I sort of like get the courage to take your hands off the keyboard, getting out of writing the sort of the perfunctory things that newsrooms just sort of like get into a habit of typing all the time.
But then do you have a physical newsroom, or do you have, your contributors?
We do. I have a place to sit.
Yeah.
And the editors have a place to sit. And our breaking news desk has a place to sit. But for our subject matter experts, our more experienced journalists, I never see them. There's no news in the Axios newsroom in Clarendon, Virginia, right? There's news at the Trump Hotel, right? There's news at Google and at Facebook. There's news out and about instead of sort of sitting here, like, retyping stories.
And are they actual staff members, or are they freelance?
They are all staff members. So the newsroom that we have is all employees. I think in the long term, about sort of how we build our model and using subject matter experts, a dream we've always had is there a way to get true experts in the field who aren't journalists, to train them to write in our style so the smart things that they know can be delivered to our readers? We haven't done that yet. It's something I think about, just haven't activated on it. So all my journalists are employees of Axios now.
And you mentioned the business model. So what is the business model? You mentioned it's a very young company still. Are you profitable? I mean, I'm assuming not yet, but what's your revenue model and how do you see it unfolding?
So our focus is advertising, events, and subscriptions. These are the three pieces essentially of any media business. They're all the same. We sell advertising on our websites and in our newsletters. With our sponsors, we hold events, often in Washington, D.C., sometimes in New York on the West Coast. And for a long-term goal, we hope to build a subscription product. I think that's just a smart way to build a business, similar to the Washington Post or the New York Times that had that. We haven't done it yet because the first two parts have done so well. So we're continuing to create free products supported by advertising. In 2018, I think we did $25 million in revenue. I think we were generally break even. That wasn't our intent. We've raised $30 million and we're still spending money to hire journalists and hire technology folks to sort of build our website and build our expertise on that. So our goal isn't profitability, but we've built a viable business in the first years, which is pretty awesome.
And what's the ultimate goal? Is it to exist for 10, 20 years, or is it being as a startup to, sell to Google or Microsoft for big bucks as soon as possible?
I don't know. Like, our founders get asked that sometimes, and they don't have a super great answer on it. Our aspirations, so before we were called Axios, like we had to invent that name, which was it was a lot of work. And so when we first went live, our Gmail address was nextgreatmediacompany@gmail.com. So I think that was our placeholder name, Next Great Media Company. So to give you a sense of our aspirations. And so what I see is we started in politics with this kind of model to figure out, okay, we know the audience and we know the subject matter, like if we should be able to figure it out in this. So starting in politics, we've now added a lot of other topics, even some sort of outlying topics like science, and sports to see if the model works in those. And we found it has, right? The reader response has been really great. Those have become very viable products. And so, my aspiration as the head of the newsroom is to sort of cover everything, like become the next great media company. Like we've clearly come upon a way of delivering information in a way that's sort of really engaging with readers and that helps people make sense of a very confusing world where they're drowning in information. Well, why don't we cover everything?
And you're sort of US focused at
We're
the
US
moment.
focused now. We have one product. We have a world newsletter, which was written out of Washington, D.C., but we have no one based outside the United States. And we're about to launch a China newsletter, but that will also be written by someone based in the United States.
But presumably this is a model which could be rolled out in other territories as well.
Absolutely. Why not? I'm nick@axios.com if any of you or international readers want to talk about franchise opportunities.
So you could see it working as a franchise rather than you retaining sort of editorial control.
This is like very speculative now. It's like, what would it look like if we were to go beyond this? I don't really know. We haven't really experimented with that at all. But I think what we've proven at a very basic level is that we have a compelling way of doing journalism and a way of writing about it in a way that sort of meets people where they are now. And so we're open to experimenting with any kind of subject matter.
You mentioned that you invested and put a lot of emphasis on formatting and how the way people read things is predicated upon formatting, or maybe this is probably a to and fro relationship. Yeah. What have you uncovered about maybe the way traditional media has done things wrong? Is it just that they're trying to ape print still on the screen, or have you made some sort of discoveries about...
They are, though.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with someone this the other day, where if you look at a newspaper website, sort of just like how it's laid out and how it looks, I can draw a line from that newspaper website to the way the front page of the newspaper looks. Mm-hmm. Like they're not completely different. They're somewhat similar. And so there are a lot of these sort of legacy things that are very difficult to shake out. And like in the way they write, news organizations are coming around to this. Like I love the way the New York Times now, when they do these big stories, will include with it, here are the 9 takeaways from that big story. Like they've heard what the readers were saying about that and are starting to pay attention. One of the most fascinating things that we did when we were launching is we had a conversation with a university professor who does eye tracking studies, who like sort of really looks at sort of how people read, particularly on digital mediums. And like the favorite thing he said that I remember is that when an eye encounters a block of text, it gets sad. Like particularly on a phone. Like if you pick up your smartphone and just look at it filled with text, and you're sort of like, what do I do with this? Where do I go? And then you look at the science behind that, sort of like how eyes jump around on text, sort of like how they don't go line by line by line. They kind of go the front of lines and then sometimes go in. And so when I edit stories and the way we train, we think a lot about, like, how can I structure this in a way? Because I know they're on their phone, they've got 90 seconds, they're moving their thumb. What are the guideposts and formatting that I can give to sort of help people sort of navigate it? Where they can go faster and slower. Like, oh, I'm interested in this. Now I'm going to go deeper, not just on this article, but on this sentence, on this line. That is how people consume information. Like they are not sitting down reading books. Even when you read books, your eye jumps around all over the kind of place. And so we think a lot about how to format it in a way that recognizes that.
What's your attitude to reader interaction? Do you have things like comments? Are people able to respond to the newsletters?
So every newsletter we send comes from the writer's real email address. So hit reply, you will reach the reader. I'm always blown away when people email me and ask for like, hey, what's this writer's email address? And I'm like, dude, he emailed you every day for the last 3 years from that email address.
That is impressive.
Right? You should write that. Right? How did you not figure that out? We do not do comments. And we've talked about it a little bit. We have no sort of imminent plans on what we're going to do about sort of reader interactivity. I've never been super impressed by comment sites on newsletters. I think they can be a very heavy lift to moderate, particularly if they're open comments and they inevitably descend into, Trump rules or Trump sucks or something like that. There are some media sites I think that have that are sort of paywalled sites that have more I guess like elite engaged audience where some of that commenting is maybe useful. But then I just go back to thinking about what does the data tell me about readers? And readers are like, they're busy, they have a lot of time. They don't want to sit and like type comments on a website. I certainly don't. So I am probably not super a fan of comments at the moment.
And how do you find readers? Is it a word of mouth thing? Is it that somehow, if people reach a certain threshold of frustration, they naturally come to Axios?
Well, I mean, I fly to Riga and I appear at a conference and I participate in a podcast. That's one way. This will get me some readers.
At least a dozen.
A lot of it is sort of talking and word of mouth. We have partnerships with NBC, so we appear a lot on MSNBC, the cable network there. We use sort of like the two ways, like any other media organization. Sort of there's a giant reader funnel. We post on Facebook, we post on Twitter. We sort of find readers in that way. They'll find us sort of searching for news on Google. And then the most effective way has just been like break news, right? Like get scoops. So when we're the first news organization to report, as we did very early after we launched, that Trump was going to leave the Paris Climate Accord. 1 million people saw that. And then my value proposition for that is like, if they'll see it, they'll realize that, wait a minute, okay, this is a trustworthy news source. They just broke an important piece of news. They clearly know what they're doing. And this format is different and very interesting. I kind of like this. And then I try and convert those people into newsletter subscribers. Then I own a relationship with them, and they're super valuable.
That's interesting. When you got a big scoop like that, did you get full citation from the other news sources, or because you mentioned earlier that they were kind of stealing your format? But
we spend there was when we were first launching, I spent probably more time than I should have emailing editors at other publications and saying like, hey, this was our scoop. My reporters got this first. You should cite us and link back to us now. I don't do that as much because they're getting a little bit like there's that moment the first time when the New York Times refers to Axios, a news website. Like, yes, we're in. I do that less now because it's not my favorite use of time, and I think they're a little bit better about saying, okay, Axios is a real news organization. We trust them and get it, and we'll give them credit.
And maybe everyone's source agnostic now.
Yeah, but I'm source agnostic, but like we'll always cite it, right? Like the New York Times reports and link back to the New York Times, and if you want to read 1,000 words on it, be my guest. That's perfectly fine.
And so what do you see happening over the next couple of years? Is your model you going to stick with your model? Is it going to be sort of tinkered with continually?
I think the model is constantly evolving. Like I went back and read the Axios website from our launch day. I was like, holy cow, like very, very different, or like the very first newsletters we sent. And so like the format is sort of like constantly, I feel like it's constantly evolving. And we're sort of like something we recently put on all our newsletters is, we kind of call it a Smart Brevity count, which is just like how many words is this newsletter and how many minutes will it take for you to read? Sort of thinking a lot about that kind of like service for sort of readers. I think that the future of news is sort of like it gets smarter and it gets faster, right? Like, and people standing in the way of those kinds of trends will be obliterated. And then what I'm very fascinated about Axios is like I'm a print person. The founders were print people. What's exciting is, can we take our model and sensibility to other platforms? And so we have a show on HBO, Axios on HBO, which just renewed for 2 more years. That was the first attempt to try and say, can we take this sensibility and bring it to video? Something I'm really interested in is how this might work in audio. Like I think there's a moment coming, certainly with the rise of smart speakers and home assistants in everyone's home. What does a news product look on that? And I think Axios is uniquely positioned, just sort of our sensibility and metabolism, to do that. And so I'm starting to think about, okay, where do I need to find sort of audio expertise to help me figure that out? Because I lack it completely.
And we've almost out of time, unfortunately, but maybe we could finish with a little bit of advice, maybe for anyone out there who's considering Axios or wants to write in an Axios kind of way. What sort of advice would you give them?
It's funny you asked that. We've started so like shortly after we launched, I got an email from a trade association in Washington saying, we love your newsletters. Can you help us fix ours? This was the Soybean Association, I think it was. And I wrote back like, no, I can't do that. I have a job. But then I thought about it and says like, wait a minute, maybe I can. And I started playing around with it. And so something I talk about a lot is, can this mechanism for delivering information work in other ways? So like, I think we've nailed it in journalism. And the advertising on our site is built in the same kind of format. So we're trying to teach these companies and ad agencies to do their advertisements in the same way. But like, we're all in the information business. Everyone is trying to convey information in certain ways, whether you're conveying it as a journalist to your readers, whether you're a boss to your employees, whether it's your company to your shareholders. And are the lessons that we've learned in delivering sort of the smart brevity writing applicable to that? That I think is fascinating just to talk about, because I think if those trends, if that is true, then there's sort of like a lot of amazing things we can do.
Nicholas, thank you very much
Thank
for
you
joining
so much.
me
This
today.
is super fun. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was produced by SSC Riga. If you'd like to learn more about the topic, visit the open course schedule at SSC Riga Executive Education. For more podcasts, find us on Spotify, iTunes, or the platform of your choice. Remember, share this episode with your friends and colleagues.